Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to have a look at prepositions. So prepositions can be tricky, but for task 1, there are certain patterns you need to remember, which will make it easier for you to not make mistakes. So let's have a look at this chart. It's about sales of smartphones in 2000. So we're going to basically look at example sentences using this chart so you can see the patterns. The 3 prepositions we'll look at in the slide is at, to, and by. So let's start with at. Sales of smartphones started at £5 million. It then stood at 2.5 million in June and finished at £7 million. So when you're talking about where something is, so where it is in the chart, then you can use at. And to be specific, actually, if you use these verbs, if you use started, stood, finished, leveled, and remain stable, then the only verb you can use is at. So remember that. If you want to use these verbs, use at. The next one is to. Smartphone revenue declined considerably to £2.5 million in June. It then rose gradually to £4.5 million. So this is different, and this is used when something moves to another point in the chart. So in this case, it was here, and then it moved to £2.5 million, and then after that it moved to £4.5 million. So when you're talking about where something moved to, then you need to use to. Yeah. And then by. Smartphone sales declined by half in June. It recovered and surged by £2 million in September. So in this case, you're talking about the difference between the figures. So you're looking at the difference between 5 and 2.5, and that is half. So smartphone sales declined by half in June, and then it recovered by £2 million. So from 2.5, the difference between 2.5 and 4.5 is £2 million. Yeah. So if you're talking about the difference between figures, then you need to use by. Let's have a look at more prepositions. Off, to, from, and, between, and. So off. Smartphone sales experienced a decline of half in June. There was then a recovery and a surge of £2 million in September. Now, if you've noticed, these sentences are exactly the same as the previous sentences, but there is a difference. That is where we're using to instead of by. Can you figure out why we are using off and not by? Well, I'll tell you. So in this case, we have verbs. So a decline of half in June, a recovery, and a surge. So when you have nouns, you need to use off. But when you have verbs, as I'll show you here, we've got verbs, we've got declined by, we've got recovered and surged, then you use by. Yeah. So let's move on to and from. This is quite straightforward. So it's used when you want to say where something was and then where it moved to. And in this case, to and from is simply where you reverse. You swap the order, so you just say to 4.5 million from 2.5 million pounds. So it's really straightforward, and you should be quite familiar with this one. Between and, sales of smartphones fluctuated or varied between 5 and 4.5 million pounds in the first 2 quarters of the year. So when you're using fluctuated and varied, you're showing how when something moved up and down, then you can use between and. So at the moment, it started at 5, it went down to 2.5, and then went back up to 4.5. So that's a fluctuation. So then you just simply say between the beginning, which is 5, million pounds to the end and 4.5 million pounds. So now you can do an exercise for me. You can find it on page 35. What I want you to do is write down the preposition we should be using, and then we'll go through the answers together. So let's go through the answers. With increases and decreases, use to. So when something increases to or decreases to show how much something increases or decreases, for verbs we use by. For nouns we use of. When you want to show a fluctuation, use between and. If you're using the verb started, stood and finished, use at, as well as verbs leveled off and remain stable. That's the end of this lesson now. I hope this gives you a better idea of how these prepositions work, and it makes it clearer when you're using them as well. So I will see you in the next lesson.